There was a fellow named Daniel Shaver. He's a white guy who was apparently pointing a BB gun out of his window, and a bunch of hotel guests saw it, and they called the cops. The cops show up and they shoot him to death. Here's a little bit of the tape.
I didn't say there's a conversation. Put your hand there! Hands up in the air! You do that again, we're shooting you. Do you understand?
Please do not shoot me.
Then listen to my instructions.
I'm trying to do what you
Don't talk! Listen! Hands straight up in the air. Do not put your hands down for any reason. You think you're going to fall, you better fall on your face. Your hands go back in the small of your back or down. We are going to shoot you. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir.
Crawl towards me. Crawl towards me!
Yes, sir.
Don't talk! Get up on him.
Okay, so they killed this guy. I mean, it looks a lot like murder, right? You can see that his hand moves sort of toward his waistband, and this is the excuse that they're using, is they reach behind him. But this video is like 7 minutes long. They brought him out in the hallway. They shouted all sorts of contradictory commands. They told him to put his hands behind his head and then crawl toward them. And then the minute that he they actually told him to put his hands kind of, I guess, behind his head and crawl toward them. Like, you can't actually do all these things. So you have one idiot supervisor who is yelling all these commands at this guy. The guy's name was Shavers, Daniel Shaver. He was 26 years old. He'd been doing rum shots of the woman he'd met earlier in the day, showing off a pellet gun he used in his job in pest control. The graphic video was recorded by Brailsford's body camera, and it showed Shaver and the woman exiting the hotel room, immediately complying with commands from multiple officers. He puts his hands in the air. He lies down on the ground while informing the officer that no one else was in the hotel room. And one of the officers, a guy named Charles Langley, says, if you make a mistake, another mistake, there's a very severe possibility you're both going to get shot. He said, I'm not here to be tactful and diplomatic with you. You listen, you obey. And then he gives him orders for 5 solid minutes. 5 solid minutes. He's playing, you know, put your right foot in, put your right foot out. He's playing the hokey pokey with him. He's playing Simon Says. He tells Shaver to put both his hands on top of his head. Then he instructs him to cross his left foot over his right foot. The guy's completely drunk. And then he says, if you move, we're going to consider that a threat. And then he says, crawl down the hallway. And he tells him to keep his legs crossed, push himself up into a kneeling position. And then his legs come uncrossed, prompting the officer to scream at him. And then he puts his hand near his waist, prompting another round of screaming. And he said, you do that again, we're going to shoot you. And he says, please don't shoot me. And then he crawls down the hallway. And at one point, because he's been lying face down, his shorts are falling down, and he's drunk, he moves to pull up his shorts, and then they shoot him to death. And the rifle that he was carrying, this cop, was etched with the phrase, you're effed. Just fantastic, guys, just fantastic. Now, there are a couple things worth pointing out here. One, bad training matters. Number two, juries almost always give the benefit of the doubt to the cop. So a lot of the evidence that was presented talked about the sort of threat that had been reported by people in the next door room. They were afraid that if they walked over to the guy, there might be someone behind the door who was going to pop out and shoot them. So the officer was acquitted in this case. But number three, the level of national outrage over this case is not even, there have been no riots, there have been no protests, nothing. And the reason for that is because the guy who was shot is white. Let's be perfectly frank about this. It's because we are more concerned with racial conflagrations in this nation than we are really about police brutality. This is a pretty clear-cut case of police brutality and police misaction, and the level of outrage over it is not even close to the level of outrage over Michael Brown, who was justifiably shot by witness testimony and by circumstantial evidence. So it's just a horrifying video right there, and it goes to show you that, you know, cops in bad situations sometimes make bad choices. This looks like manslaughter to me, at the very least. Running with the cops is not to have a run-in with the cops. Okay. Meaning that, as a general rule, you know, virtually every immigrant community to the United States, I'll take as an example, virtually every immigrant community to the United States originally had lots of problems with the cops. The Jewish community early in the 20th century had a lot of problems with the cops in New York. The Italian community had lots of problems with the cops. The Irish community, the German community, the Hispanic community, virtually all of them, when they came to the United States, had the Asian community had significant problems with the cops. As crime rates decline in those communities, it turns out that the problems with the cops tend to disappear. And so the easiest way to get rid of a lot of these problems is not to put all the onus on the cops, but to say, okay, the cops are human. They're going to make some bad mistakes, and we need to prosecute them if they do something really terrible, obviously. But if you really want to tackle this thing on a systemic level, crime rates have to go down. How about the Black Lives Matter movement's contention that when police do come into contact with black folks, they treat them with more violence? Well, that's nonsense, too. There's a study that just came out from John Jay College, Professor Peter Moskos, and what he found is that in situations where the police were confronted with force by whites and blacks, the white people were shot significantly more often than the black folks. As early as 1994, well, I'm sorry, they're called statistics, and they're useful. You should use them. As early as 1994, the Department of Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. With the oversaturation of the victimhood and the media programming that there is victimhood in I was going to say Chicago, but in America, in the streets, and with police murders and brutality that is being kind of pushed over the masses, and they're kind of trying to get our attention to see that. I was curious about your stance on police training and just in the future.
So police training, I think, does vary city to city, right? I mean, and I think that not every police department is the same.
Right.
And so if you were to say that there is, I would say that there's obviously a police training problem in Chicago, right? And that I think anybody would acknowledge. To attribute that to racism, I'm not willing to do that unless you actually have evidence that it's race-based mistraining. Because a cop can shoot a black person wrongly and not be shooting the black person because that person's black. Right. So you can look at Laquan McDonald, to take an example, and say they shot this person wrongly, but I don't have evidence that the cop who shot him did it because he was out to get a black guy that day. Right. So as far as heightening police standards for training, I think even most police departments would say that's great. I think it's also important to acknowledge that police have legitimately the hardest job in America, and expecting them to act like automatons is kind of difficult.
My father was a police officer.
Yeah, exactly. So everybody, I think, it's very easy to second guess police officers. It really is, because we only see that one tape that comes out later. Definitely. But if you go out there every day not knowing if you're going to come home at night, then you'd be a little bit edgy too. So that's not to excuse bad activity. It is to say that we should, a lot of these circumstances are a little bit more fast and dirty than people like to acknowledge in sort of the world removed from policing. But yeah, I mean, listen, I think that most police departments would acknowledge that they have there's some bad apples. There's some people who can't be trained well. There's some people who need more training. And hopefully our police departments get better. All I can say is this: the easiest way to avoid a run-in with the cops is not to have a run-in with the cops. Meaning that as a general rule, virtually every immigrant community to the United States, I'll take as an example, virtually every immigrant community to the United States originally had lots of problems with the cops. The Jewish community early in the 20th century had a lot of problems with the cops in New York. The Italian community had lots of problems with the cops. The Irish community, the German community, the Hispanic community, virtually all of them, when they came to the United States, had the Asian community had significant problems with the cops. As crime rates decline in those communities, it turns out that the problems with the cops tend to disappear. And so the easiest way to get rid of a lot of these problems is not to put all the onus on the cops, but to say, okay, the cops are human. They're going to make some bad mistakes, and we need to prosecute them if they do something really terrible, obviously. But if you really want to tackle this thing on a systemic level, crime rates have to go down. The fewer times you come into contact with the cops, the better off you're going to be safety-wise, because it just gives them less opportunities to make a mistake, which obviously they don't want to do either.
Thank you for sharing.
Thanks a lot.
I'm curious to know your main objections to the libertarian ideology. In short, why conservatism over libertarianism?
Okay, so this is a great question. So here's my view on conservatives and libertarians. I have a very libertarian view of government. I have a very conservative view of society. What I mean by that is that libertarians very often will say that social institutions that are conservative are not necessary. So a lot of libertarians are very anti-churches. They're very anti kind of community organizations. They're very atomistic in their view of individuals, that every individual is their own island, and even leaving aside government, there's no reason to have religious communities because those religious communities are oppressive and all this kind of thing. My view of libertarian government is pretty much the same as the libertarians, which is the government sucks at everything and shouldn't be involved in virtually anything. I agree with that. I think that why I'm a conservative and not a libertarian is because I also understand that there's a social fabric that libertarianism doesn't tend to talk a lot about. And that social fabric only exists in the presence of common values that we all share. I say that those values should not be inculcated by government. Those values should be values that are held at the community level. Right? We should all have these decent values that we're taught by our family and by our churches and by our friends, and that's what's going to allow us to live together. Libertarianism falls apart without the social fabric. Every society falls apart without the social fabric. And when society starts to fall apart, what ends up happening is people look to the government to enforce. And so if you actually want a lasting libertarianism, then you need to acknowledge, and I think some libertarians do, but I think it needs to become an increasing thing, libertarians need to acknowledge the value of the social fabric, the value of social organizations, the value of churches, the values of the Judeo-Christian ethic that many of them don't acknowledge. And once that happens, then I think there can be a conservative-libertarian merger. And I think that that's where I hope the conservative movement and the libertarian movement go in the future, as opposed to the libertarian movement right now seems to be split between some people who agree with me and some people who sort of agree with the left on a lot of social policy, leaving aside government, just talking about, you know, kind of pansexual free-for-all in Ayn Rand land. And that's not something that I'm fond of. Ayn Rand is great when it comes to capitalism, and she's less good when it comes to her views of how social fabric is constructed.
Okay, thank you. Do you mind if I shake your hand?
Of course. Hey, thanks a lot.